Eliade, Joyce, and the Terror of History. More than any other student of the history of religions, the late Monsieur Eliade concerned himself with the theme of the manifestation of the sacred in literature. In The Quest, Eliade called forcefully for other scholars in his field to display the same breadth and openness toward their material that historians of literature and literary critics show towards theirs. In his essay, Cultural Fashions and the History of Religion, Eliade pointed out the unique insights which historians of religion are able to bring to literature, citing as an example the structural analogy between the wanderings of Leopold Bloom in James Joyce's Ulysses and similar perambulations of hero ancestors in certain myths of the Australian Aborigines. There are instances, Eliade asserts, when only a historian of religion can discover some secret significance of a cultural creation, whether ancient or contemporary. It is far from surprising that Eliade should choose an example from Joyce to illustrate this idea. Perhaps the works of no other author are more directly concerned with the persistence of mythical patterns in modern existence. Indeed, the serious student of Joyce is almost compelled to make of himself an amateur historian of religions, even if, as Eliade seems to suggest, historians of religion resist making reciprocal kinds of expedition into the field of literature. The connections between Eliade's concerns and those of Joyce are deep. Eliade was an early reader of Joyce, and several of his creative works owe an acknowledged debt to Joycean stylistic techniques. Beyond these correspondences, the two writers have many concerns in common: a shared encyclopedic range of knowledge, and fascination with encyclopedism for its own sake, a particular interest in the philosophies of the Italian Renaissance, particularly those of Vico and Bruno, and perhaps certain similarities of outlook based on the shared experience of self-exile and of inspiration drawn from the mother country. Such coincidences of interest between the two writers are particularly striking. Eliade, perhaps consciously following Joyce's similar remarks to Frank Budgen, suggests that Ulysses is the prototype of man and takes him for his personal emblem. Both Joyce and Eliade are concerned with the symbolism of the center, the axis mundi, the omphalos, although Eliade's interest is more general, Joyce's concrete. For the latter, the center is always Dublin. Both are fascinated with the coincidence and reconciliation of opposites, and both have carefully studied the works of Giordano Bruno in this regard. Each is interested in the variety of manifestations of the sacred. Joyce's discussion of his epiphanies might fruitfully be examined in light of Eliade's work on hierophanies in the sacred and the profane. Eliade himself has noted that the work of Joyce is saturated with nostalgia for the myth of eternal repetition and, in the last analysis, for the abolition of time. The most striking example in literature of the myth of the eternal return may well be Finnegan's Wake, a wholly new work based on the premise that there is nothing new under the sun, in Richard Ellmann's words. In its cyclical structure, in its role as cosmogonic myth, Joyce's book is patently expressive of the repetition of creation so important in Eliade's work, sentenced to be nuzzled over a full trillion times forever and a night by that ideal reader suffering from an ideal insomnia. It is obviously about the abolition of time. Joyce's intentions in Ulysses are more accessible than they are in The Wake, and their relationships to themes treated by Eliade are no less remarkable. I have discovered in Ulysses all of the connections between the two authors which I have discussed above, and no doubt many others could be found. Here, however, I will limit my discussion to the terror of history, a theme which figures significantly in Eliade's work. My intention is twofold: to furnish evidence for the validity of Eliade's deeply troubling thesis and extraordinary conclusions by trying them in the crucible of Ulysses, and to apply Eliade's theoretical insights to illuminate in some small way the extraordinary resonance and power of Joyce's novel. 1. The clearest presentation of Eliade's concept of the terror of history is to be found in the myth of the eternal return. In this work, Eliade argues that archaic man sought to live in the timeless horizon of a continually recreated archetypal present, repeating the actions and gestures performed in illo tempore, in those days, that is to say, in a mythical first time, by the gods or by the legendary ancestors. Closely related to seasonal patterns, this eternal present would periodically be destroyed and renewed. The Hebrews, by interpreting the misfortunes which they suffered as the concrete expression of the same single divine will, introduced a linear concept of time in which events, happening once, possessed their own significance and in fact were seen as theophanies. In this way, according to Eliade, the Hebrews invented or discovered history. While the men of archaic societies could cope with misfortune by denying to purely historical events the status of ontological reality, and the Jew, and later Christian, could withstand or transcend misfortune by the vehicle of faith in a single all-powerful God, modern man, having accepted history but abandoned faith, has left himself defenseless against the perceived meaninglessness of calamitous events. This, for Eliade, is the terror of history. The historistic position, although it has come to dominate our culture, remains disarmed against this terror. It is by no means mere fortuitous coincidence that, in this philosophy, despair, the amor fati, and pessimism are elevated to the rank of heroic virtues and instruments of cognition. Having discussed the inadequacies of the historicist position from Leibniz through Heidegger, Eliade, in a footnote, makes the following observation. We take the liberty of emphasizing that historicism was created and professed above all by thinkers belonging to nations for which history has never been a continuous terror. These thinkers would perhaps have adopted another viewpoint had they belonged to nations marked by the fatality of history. It would certainly be interesting, in any case, to know if the history according to which everything that happens is good, simply because it happened, would have been accepted without qualms by the thinkers of the Baltic countries, or of the Balkans, or of colonial territories. The terror of history is starkly real to Eliade, partly as a result of his Romanian background. In numerous works he has discussed his country's tortured history, its ceaseless victimization at the hands of wave after wave of invaders, the consequence of its geographical position at a crossroads between continents, and its equally unhappy experiences at the hands of indigenous tyrants. Joyce's views towards his native land were always more ambivalent than Eliade's, for reasons which are complex. But Joyce clearly felt that Ireland, too, was among the nations marked by the fatality of history. The soul of the country, he wrote in 1907, is weakened by centuries of useless struggle and broken treaties, and individual initiative is paralyzed by the influence and admonitions of the Church, while its body is manacled by the police, the tax office, and the garrison. No one who has any self-respect stays in Ireland, but flees afar as though from a country that has undergone the visitation of an angered Jove. What is more remarkable in this context is the degree to which Ireland's response to centuries of useless struggle resembles the response to misfortune attributed by Eliade to archaic societies. In the words of the Australian historian P. O'Farrell, Ireland experienced a curious, perhaps unique telescoping of time, a compression of the popular experience of 4 centuries into one. Famine, Mountjoy, Land League, penal laws, Cromwell, Grattan's Parliament, all merged together to take their place as a living yesterday. Time, sequence, size, perspective, all vanished until present reality encompassed the simultaneous experience of all that had passed. History, as past, had ceased to be. While certainly curious, Ireland's rejection of history is not unique, as Eliade's data concerning other cultures have shown. It is an entirely comprehensible response to history's terror. In Farrell's description, we can see not only the attempt to abolish linear time, but the transformation of historical events into mythical ones. Eliade has discussed this tendency to create archetypal experiences. The memory of historical events is modified, after 2 or 3 centuries, in such a way that it can enter into the mold of the archaic mentality, which cannot accept what is individual, and preserves only what is exemplary. Although the creation of such an eternal present can serve as a shield against despair, in the modern world its byproduct is an inexorable tendency to defeat, paralysis, and failure. The reason for this is that any alteration in the pattern involves a profanation of sacred time, as Eliade demonstrated in The Sacred and the Profane. Thus, real victory, on the historical plane, would bring the whole edifice crashing down. Elsewhere, I have discussed this notion with regard to the abortive Easter Rising, which Patrick Pearse and his colleagues undertook not to achieve a victory, but to serve as a blood sacrifice for Ireland. In this overtly messianic attitude, one can perhaps catch a glimpse of an Ireland redeemed, purified, sanctified. Evidently, an Ireland existing on a plane other than that of ordinary profane existence. This is a theme which permeates the literature of the Romantic nationalist cause, particularly that of the Gaelic revival, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Perhaps we can see in the Irish Civil War and its still lingering aftermath an Irish counterpart to the rejection of the modern state of Israel by several of the Hasidic and other ultra-Orthodox Jewish sects. This messianic background in Ireland sets the tone for much of what happens in Ulysses. On one level, after all, the book is about the creation of the new Blue Musalem, and the careful reader of Ulysses is aware that this is not at all playful hyperbole. The reader of Eliade, as well, finds the possibility of a radical and complete liberation from history discussed in very serious terms. While Eliade states in the myth of the eternal return that at the present moment a conflict exists between two views, the archaic conception, which we should designate as archetypal and anhistorical, and the modern post-Hegelian conception, which seeks to be historical. He also discloses to us a third alternative, one based on a radical, emancipating acceptance of faith. The following passage from the conclusion of the book is of fundamental importance here. Basically, the horizon of archetypes and repetition cannot be transcended with impunity unless we accept a philosophy of freedom that does not exclude God. And indeed this proved to be true when the horizon of archetypes and repetition was transcended, for the first time, by Judeo-Christianism, which introduced a new category into religious experience, the category of faith. It must not be forgotten that, if Abraham's faith can be defined as for God everything is possible, the faith of Christianity implies that everything is also possible for man. Have faith in God, for verily I say unto you, that whosoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, but shall believe that those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. Therefore I say unto you, what things soever ye desire, when ye pray, believe that ye receive them, and ye shall have them. Mark 11:22-24. Faith in this context, as in many others, means absolute emancipation from any kind of natural law, and hence the highest freedom that man can imagine, freedom to intervene even in the ontological constitution of the universe. It is, consequently, a preeminently creative freedom. In other words, it constitutes a new formula for man's collaboration with the creation, the first, but also the only such formula accorded to him since the traditional horizon of archetypes and repetition was transcended. Only such a freedom, aside from its soteriological, hence in the strict sense its religious value, is able to defend modern man from the terror of history. A freedom, that is, which has its source and finds its guarantee and support in God. 2. With Eliade's audacious pronouncement in mind, let us turn to Ulysses. Joyce makes his attitude toward history and the attitudes of his characters fairly clear in the book's first 4 chapters. Stephen Dedalus is acutely stricken with the terror of history, as he tells his boss, Mr. Deasy. History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. The recent death of his mother has made him confront the impermanence of life. Significantly, he would not accede to her deathbed wish that he kneel down to pray for her. Jesuit-educated Stephen is an agnostic, and he is agonizingly aware of its implications. This is clearly brought out in his exchange with the Englishman Haynes. "You're not a believer, are you?" Haynes asked. I mean a believer in the narrow sense of the word, creation from nothing, and miracles and a personal God. There's only one sense of the word, it seems to me, Stephen said. Yes, of course, Haynes said. Either you believe or you don't, isn't it? Personally, I couldn't stomach that idea of a personal God. You don't stand for that, I suppose. You behold in me, Stephen said with grim displeasure, a horrible example of free thought. Haynes, the representative of the nation always on the winning side of history, responds, After all, I should think you are able to free yourself. You are your own master, it seems to me. He then proceeds to dispose of the entire tragic, barbarous relationship between England and Ireland with a single, supercilious remark. We feel in England that we have treated you rather unfairly. It seems history is to blame. Naturally, Haynes is unable to appreciate the importance of his own remark, but the reader should not be deceived into discounting its significance on account of its source. His breezy assertions are the classic expressions of an inhabitant of a nation unmarked by the fatality of history. He believes in the possibility of personal freedom in the absence of faith, although he retains a hypocritical sensation of titillated embarrassment in the presence of Buck Mulligan's blasphemous jokes and ditties. Interestingly, Haynes's bland, vaunted confidence deserts him at night when he is plagued by terrible nightmares of panthers. Stephen's agnosticism is the flinty integrity of the heretic, in the original sense of the word, deriving from the Greek herein, to choose. Stephen understands the life or death seriousness of the choice, but he is not Tertullian. He cannot bring himself to believe in what he knows to be absurd. Still less, however, can he stomach Haynes's wishy-washy Protestantism, which is for Stephen, and for Joyce, a craven retreat from rationality. In A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he exclaims, What kind of liberation would that be, to forsake an absurdity which is logical and coherent, and to embrace one which is illogical and incoherent? Mulligan, the mocking medical student, is far sharper intellectually than Haynes. An Irishman, he is as conscious as Daedalus of the terror of history. In order to shield himself from the painfulness of his awareness, he has erected a wall of blasphemous mockery and buffoonery, has made himself stage Irish. It is easy to detect beneath Mulligan's flippant exterior a profound despair, but Mulligan is hard to pity because he is dangerous. He must seek to destroy truth and deny the possibility of spirit in order to justify its own miserable existence. In Eliade's terms, he is a victim of that spiritual aridity that always brings with it a relativistic or nihilistic view of history. In Garrett Deasy, the headmaster of the school where Stephen teaches, Joyce has given us a portrait of archaic man who defends himself against history by living in a permanent, unchanging, mythical time. Deasy, an old Ulster Protestant, governs his life by reliance on ancient mottos, reactionary prejudices, banal platitudes. Stephen notes the unchanging appearance of Mr. Deasy's study with its ancient memorabilia. As it was in the beginning, is now. On the sideboard the tray of Stuart coins, base treasure of a bog, and ever shall be. Joyce is kinder to Deasy than readers of Ulysses tend to be, and than Stephen is. Responding to Deasy's obvious foolishness and crude bigotry, most readers misunderstand the significance of his comment. All human history moves toward one great goal, the manifestation of God, and of Stephen's retort. That is God, a shout in the street. If we recognize that Mr. Deasy, rather than representing Christianity, exists on an archaic and historical plane, we can see that his comment is true, since history for him is the repetition of archetypes, the constant recreation of the sacred. Stephen's retort, while on one level impertinent, can also be understood as expressing a serious theological idea, which, while ironic, is not atheistic. In the soccer game being played outside, a goal had been scored just before Mr. Deasy made his statement that the great goal of history is the manifestation of God. Hence Stephen's comment comes from his mental connection between the two goals. That is God. It is also a demonstration of the idea that Stephen's God is manifest in the material world, in the here and now, not in the hollow shells of Mr. Deasy's perennially repeated gestures. But Joyce's final judgment of Deasy is not harsh. He graces him with one of the most beautiful sentences in Ulysses. On his wise shoulders, through the checkerwork of leaves, the sun flung spangles, dancing coins. In the following chapter, Proteus, Stephen walks along Sandymount Strand, and we can see that his handle on the material world is none too tight. He is prone to solipsism, which he recognizes and considers a fault. He closes his eyes and wonders, has all vanished since? See now, there all the time without you, and ever shall be, world without end. Inside Stephen's mind, we can feel him force his attention to his immediate environment. Follow him as he drifts off in his imagination to his uncle's bedside. Watch him snap back. The chapter is about his acknowledgement of his physical reality, his humanity. Cousin Stephen, you will never be a saint. And his Irishness. True Irishness to Stephen is exile, symbolized by the aging Irish revolutionary Kevin Egan, whom Stephen recalls from Paris. Ireland is here equated with Israel, for the first time of many in the book. They have forgotten Kevin Egan, not he them, remembering thee, O Sion. If the Proteus episode is about Stephen's acceptance of the material world, in the final analysis, Stephen's strongest connection to physical reality is through his fears. Dogs, horses, firearms, the sea, thunderstorms, machinery, the country roads at night. These fears are his link to the real. It is his fear of a dog on the beach, in fact, which forces him to face his deepest questions of self-doubt. Mulligan, he recalls, has displayed great courage by throwing himself into the Liffey to rescue a drowning man. He saved men from drowning, and you shake at a cur's yelping. We don't want any of your medieval abstrusiosities. Would you do what he did? The truth, spit it out. I would want to. I would try. I am not a strong swimmer. What really haunts him, though, is the death of his mother. I could not save her. Waters, bitter death, lost. Immersed in thoughts of death and decay, Stephen remembers Mulligan's nickname for him and is tempted again with notions of superiority and isolation. Toothless Kinch, the Superman. Why is that, I wonder? Or does it mean something, perhaps? He has picked his nose, but is without his handkerchief, so he deposits the results on a rock, in order, says Richard Ellmann, to parade his unsociability. For the rest, let look who will, Stephen thinks. But then he looks around. Behind, perhaps there is someone. Stephen's embarrassed furtiveness, Ellmann explains, demonstrates his connection to the outside world. This backward glance is a parting denial of the subjectivist universe. Since Stephen is an artist, Joyce implies that art is not self-isolation, that it depends upon recognition of other existences as well as one's own. 3. Bloom does not have Stephen's difficulty. He is firmly rooted in the material world. Bloom is scientific in that he is open to observable reality and believes in it, in a way that Stephen really does not. But, too, he has an archaic sensitivity to sympathetic relations between seemingly discrete occurrences.
Watering cart,
he notes as he walks along the street.
To provoke the rain on earth as it is in heaven.
And indeed, a cloud suddenly begins to block the sun. As an Irish Jew, Bloom is simultaneously a citizen of two nations marked by the fatality of history, both of them nations of exiles. As much as Stephen, Bloom is deeply susceptible to history's terror. His thoughts are drawn to it when he is handed a leaflet describing a Zionist agricultural scheme in Palestine.
Nothing doing.
Bloom reflects.
Still, an idea behind it.
A moment later, the sun is covered by the cloud. Bloom gloomily retracts his earlier mental comment, on earth as it is in heaven.
No, not like that. A barren land, bare waste, Volcanic lake, the Dead Sea, no fish, weedless, sunk deep in the earth. No wind would lift those waves, grey metal, poisonous, foggy waters. Brimstone, they called it, raining down. The cities of the plains, Sodom, Gomorrah, Edom, all dead names. A dead sea in a dead land, grey and old. Old now. It bore the oldest, the first race.
A bent hag crossed from Cassidy's, clutching a noggin bottle by the neck.
The oldest people wandered far away all over the earth. Captivity to captivity, multiplying, dying, being born everywhere. It lay there now. Now it could bear no more. Dead. An old woman's. The grey, sunken cunt of the world. Desolation.
Having chilled his blood with a vision which could have come to an Old Testament prophet, Bloom, the modern man, tries to compose himself.
Well, I'm here now. Morning mouth, bad images, got up wrong side of the bed. Must begin those Sandow's exercises.
And yet there are portents of an exalted role for Bloom. A YMCA young man gives him a handout. Blue? Me? No, blood of the lamb. The leaflet only announces the speaking engagement of J. Alexander Dowie, restorer of the church in Zion, Illinois. But its message, Elijah is coming, percolates throughout the book. The great irony of Ulysses is that consciously modern, thoroughly agnostic Bloom, he says your soul, you have no soul inside, only grey matter, because he doesn't know what it is to have one, fumes Molly later, should unwittingly, and entirely without his knowledge, be transformed by the grace of his creator Joyce, not only into Ulysses, but also into Elijah, and even into the Messiah. The narrator revels in the contradiction set up between scientifically minded Bloom and Bloom the Redeemer. He throws the crumpled YMCA announcement off the O'Connell Bridge. Elijah 32 feet per sec is At moments like this, it is particularly important to keep in mind the observation of James H. Maddox, Jr. Anyone familiar with Joyce's methods in Ulysses, and the sensibility displayed in all of Joyce's work, comes to suspect that the statements of value closest to Joyce's own are the statements most crowded out by irony. Much of the power in Ulysses is derived from its solid grounding in the material, the real. In his art, Joyce can allow himself such a long tether and can wander into the most Byzantine of stylistic distortions because the narrative has its very roots in objects and facts. From a certain point of view, then, the transformations which take place in Ulysses can be seen as alchemical. They represent the transmutation of the dreary sameness of existence, the most commonplace, the deadest among the living, as Joyce wrote, into the heroic, the mythic, the sacred. Nations, wrote Joyce, have their ego, just like individuals. If this is so, then Joyce is justified in discovering in Ireland the kind of mythical and historical parallels with which he invests his human characters in Ulysses. Thus, Ireland is successively Greece, Eden, and above all, of course, Zion. The analogy is inevitable. It has been common since the days in which O'Connell, the liberator, was compared to Moses. But Joyce takes the representation a step further by having Bloom stand for Israel and Ireland. Maddox has explained why. The outsider represents in quintessential form the society from which he has been excluded. Like the woman in Victorian fiction or the black man in modern American fiction, Joyce's outsider becomes the focus of his culture. 4. Although himself an exile, Eliade always viewed Romania from the inside. Romania in the first quarter of the 20th century shared many characteristics with Ireland. In his autobiography, Eliade described the urgent efforts of the Romanian intelligentsia to tap the roots of its folklore to develop a genuinely nationalistic culture. The Irish correlative to this movement offended Joyce's sensibilities, and he lampooned it uproariously in the Cyclops episode of Ulysses. Eliade would seem at one time to have had more sympathy for the approach of Joyce's citizen, however. In his novel, Hooligans, Eliade created two characters who illustrate a mode of being in the world that I designated hooliganic, because it implies at once an unconscious impulse to brutality and an absolute self-confidence. These characters would help Romania to break free from the terror of history and the torpor of resignation. What mattered to them above all was the obtaining of a mode of being that would allow them, on the one hand, to create, and on the other, to triumph in history. I believed in the possibility of a Romanian Renaissance, and for that reason I allowed myself to portray such heroes. But I was also afraid that history would prevent us from bringing it into being. In desperation, I tried to imagine what might be done: retreat from confrontation with history, the acceptance of the traditional destiny of the Romanian intellectual. To fail, or to survive humbly on the periphery of society, did not seem to be a solution. I said to myself that, for the present, I must break out of this vicious circle. The intellectual who cannot win because a victory would imply the nullification of his mode of being as intellectual. The Romanian situation, as described by Eliade, is clearly analogous to the one faced by turn-of-the-century Ireland, at which we have already looked. With that in mind, we are in a better position to understand the extremism embodied in Ireland by General Owen O'Duffy's Blue Shirt movement, and in Romania by the Iron Guard. The Second World War made it clear to Eliade and to the rest of the world that, far from circumventing the terror of history, cultivation of an impulse to brutality and absolute self-confidence had catalyzed the release of terrors previously unknown to history. Bloom has understood the futility of the kind of resistance called for in Hooligani. Demonstrating remarkable physical as well as moral courage, Bloom stands up to the Irish chauvinists in Barney Kiernan's pub.
And I belong to a race, too, that is hated and persecuted. Also now, this very moment, this very instant.
Gob he near putting his fingers with the butt of his old cigar.
Robbed, plundered, insulted, persecuted. Taking what belongs to us by right. At this very moment.
Says he, putting up his fist.
Sold by auction off in Morocco like slaves or cattles.
Are you talking about the New Jerusalem?
I'm talking about injustice.
Right,
Says John Wise.
stand up to it then with force like men.
That's an almanac picture for you. Mark for a soft-nosed bullet. Old lardy face standing up to the business end of a gun. Gob, he'd adored in a sweeping bush, so he would, if he only had a nurse's apron on him. And then he collapses all of a sudden, twisting around all the opposite, as limp as a wet rag.
But it's no use. Force, hatred, history, all that. That's not life for men and women, insult and hatred. And everybody knows that it's the very opposite of that that is really life.
What?
Says Alf.
Love.
Says Bloom. While Bloom is out of the pub, the patrons discuss him.
That's the new Messiah for Ireland.
Says the citizen.
Island of saints and sages.
Well, they're still waiting for their Redeemer.
Says Martin.
For that matter, so are we.
Yes,
Says JJ.
and every male that's born, they think it may be their Messiah. And every Jew is in a tall state of excitement, I believe, till he knows if he's a father or a mother.
Expecting every moment will be his next.
Says Lenihan.
A moment later, Bloom, the free-thinking, secular convert to Protestantism and thence to Catholicism, is defending the Jewish race with ardor and courage, if also with some confusion.
Mendelssohn was a Jew, and Karl Marx and Mercadante and Spinoza. And the Savior was a Jew, and his father was a Jew, your God.
He had no father. That is due now. Drive ahead.
Whose God? Well, his uncle was a Jew. Your God was a Jew. Christ was a Jew like me.
In making his escape from the enraged citizen, who makes after him with a thoroughly hierophanized biscuit tin, Ben Bloom Elijah is carried off into heaven in a chariot amid clouds of angels. At an angle of 45 degrees over Donahoe's in Little Green Street, like a shot off a shovel. Since the apotheosis is a comic one, Ellmann writes, it at once exalts Bloom and recalls him to purely human proportions. In Ordeal by Labyrinth, Eliade discussed Ulysses with Claude-Henri Rocquet. On 7th March 1963, you wrote, "We are wonderstruck, we marvel, just like the Aborigines when Leopold Bloom stops off in a bar and orders a beer." Rocquet observed, "Does not that mean that in order to attain self-consciousness, man needs a mirror, a record, words, In short, that the world becomes real only through an imaginative process? Yes, responded Eliade. One becomes oneself when one learns one's history, or, as in Bloom's case, when one takes one's history upon oneself. Reading more deeply than before into the folk background of his own country, Eliade came to an understanding of the meaning of history for Romania, which agrees with Bloom's in its rejection of force and in the centrality of love. In Zalmoxis, the Vanishing God, he concluded that the folk ballad, Majoritza, in which a young shepherd transmutes his own murder at the hands of strangers into a transcendent marriage with the cosmos, contained the highest expression of the peasant genius of transforming Romania's tragic destiny into a creative affirmation of the sacrality of the entire universe. Creation, Eliade affirmed to Rocquet, is the only answer one can give to fate, to the terror of history. Stephen and Bloom transcend the terror of history in exactly this way, by creating. Stephen's struggle through Ulysses has been to remain faithful to his artistic vision in the face of all the temptations of the day. At the same time, he has discovered, through Bloom, his humanity, which is what makes his artistic success possible and meaningful. Bloom, himself Joyce's greatest creation, and thereby his source of liberation, achieves his goal on a number of levels, the most gigantic of which we have already discussed. Bloom's most poignant, human, and beautiful creation is provided through the agency of Stephen at the end of the Circe episode, when Bloom, ministering to Stephen in the street, has a vision of a fairy boy of 11, a changeling, Rudy, Bloom's dead son, brought back for a moment, but restored to Bloom forever, from another world. In only somewhat transcendent and sentimental terms, we learn in the Ithaca episode that by the end of the day, Bloom is satisfied. What satisfied him? To have sustained no positive loss, to have brought a positive gain to others, light to the Gentiles. The terror of history, in the final analysis, is the fear of death. Death not simply of the body, or even of the individual, but of the dreams, hopes, and loves that make up a life. The Ithaca episode of Ulysses enumerates some of Bloom's. Among the intellectual pursuits he would have liked to undertake is the comparative study of religions. On the archaic plane, one could not be touched by such fears. One's own death, as an individual, could be accepted, since it was integrated within a sacred horizon of infinite repetitions, always the same. In effect, rebirths. Modern man can no longer achieve even the limited form of immortality offered by cycles of repetition. His only hope of life is to strive to encompass the whole of time and space. In other words, to become one with God. Mircea Eliade has spoken of the ability of faith to move mountains. Leopold Bloom had gone further and shown that the basis of life is love. If I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. 1 Corinthians 13:2. Leopold Bloom himself, as real to the readers of Ulysses as are people of flesh and blood, is living proof of the truth of his belief in the power of love.